The morning began with the measured precision that defined Thomas Rourke's entire diving career. Over the course of 2 decades beneath the surface, he had cultivated a rigid discipline, every checklist followed, every piece of equipment double-checked, every movement underwater deliberate. He was not one of those thrill-seekers drawn to diving by the rush of venturing into the unknown. For him, it was about control, data, and routine. That morning, the waters off the continental shelf near Isla de las Serpientes had been unusually still. There were no warning signs, no turbulence, no sudden changes in tide. Everything on the surface had been ideal. The mission, while unofficial, had scientific roots. An obscure research foundation had provided coordinates and a grant. They were interested in collecting geological samples from a region of the seabed that had, for unknown reasons, never been successfully mapped in detail. Most prior attempts had either failed due to equipment malfunction or returned data riddled with inconsistencies. The site was colloquially referred to by local divers as El Vacío, the void. Most avoided it, citing superstitious tales of confusion, malfunction, or worse. Thomas dismissed those accounts as folklore and confirmation bias. He trusted numbers, not rumors. He descended slowly, maintaining a steady breathing pattern and watching the readings on his dive computer closely. The device was one of the newest models, a custom-calibrated unit capable of monitoring not only depth, oxygen saturation, and pressure, but also subtle changes in ambient electromagnetic fields. Manufactured in Germany, it had never given a false reading. He had tested it under various conditions, from cold glacial dives in Iceland to volcanic vents in the Pacific. It had always performed with flawless precision. As he passed the 40-meter mark, he logged his descent in the accompanying slate. Visibility was moderate, with particles suspended in the water like fragments of falling ash. He activated his headlamp, illuminating a slope of dark basalt leading downward at an unnaturally uniform angle. There were no coral formations, no fish, no signs of life, just a sheer descent into shadow. It was disorienting not because of darkness, but because of the absence of the expected. No sea fans, no crustaceans, no algae, no texture to indicate time or growth. Just cold, sterile stone. At 65 meters, his dive computer continued tracking smoothly. Breathing remained calm. Nitrogen narcosis was always a possibility at this depth, but he had trained extensively to recognize its symptoms: confusion, euphoria, impaired judgment, and he felt none of them. He began collecting rock samples, placing them into the tethered collection net. As he leaned into the slope to secure a particularly jagged piece, he noticed a sudden drop in ambient temperature. His skin prickled. He paused, expecting the computer to register a change. It did, but not the one he anticipated. The depth reading had changed. It had jumped. Without any sensation of further descent, the screen now displayed 123 meters. He blinked, then blinked again. For a moment, he assumed he had misread the display. He adjusted the backlight brightness and brought it closer. Still 123.1 meters. He had neither moved significantly downward nor lost track of time. His dive log confirmed his position had changed by less than a meter since collecting the last sample. He checked his backup analog depth gauge. It read just under 70 meters, consistent with his expectations. His first instinct was to assume a software glitch, but he had conducted his last firmware update only a week ago, and the device had passed diagnostics since. He rebooted the unit. It restarted cleanly, recalibrated, and again displayed 123.3 meters. His analog gauge, however, remained steady. Thomas was not one to panic, but he understood the risk. In diving, discrepancies in depth readings could lead to misjudged decompression times a fatal error. His mind began racing through possibilities. Could the dive computer have misread local barometric pressure? Was there a fault in the pressure sensor? He removed the device from his wrist, held it still in the water before him, and watched. The numbers continued climbing. 124.7, 125.9. It was tracking as though he were falling rapidly, despite the sensation of hovering motionless. Then, without warning, it froze. The screen locked at 128.4 meters. The dive computer emitted a long, high-pitched tone, its emergency alert, usually reserved for critical failures. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had never heard that sound in open water. He immediately began his controlled ascent, checking his analog instruments for consistency. His air levels were stable. His depth ascent rate was within safe margins. Yet the dive computer remained frozen, the alert tone droning like a mechanical scream into the surrounding silence. When he broke the surface 16 minutes later, the tone ceased abruptly. He removed the unit and held it to his ear. Nothing. The screen had gone black. Later that evening, inside his cabin, he connected the dive computer to his laptop and initiated a data dump. The log file, encrypted as usual, was intact. It showed all expected readings up until a specific point. Then the log shifted abruptly. The depth values began incrementing in erratic intervals, reaching over 600 meters before the data stream abruptly terminated. It wasn't just a sensor failure. The file suggested the computer had believed it had descended to a depth no human body could withstand, and that it had done so in less than a minute. That was not a malfunction. It was something else. The room was dim, lit only by the dull glow of his laptop screen and the rhythmic pulse of the external hard drive. Thomas sat motionless in the center of the cabin, the silence around him broken only by the creak of old wood and the quiet hum of electronics. The dive computer lay on the table in front of him like a broken relic, its screen dark, its function unresponsive. He had tried every reset protocol he knew. It wouldn't power on. But the data had already been transferred, the evidence preserved. That was what mattered. He leaned forward, navigating the hex-coded strings of the dive log. Each entry carried a timestamp, pressure value, depth calculation, and environmental metadata normal until exactly 10:42 a.m., when the readings began to fragment. At first, the descent appeared linear, logical. A drop from 70 to 90 meters in 5 seconds. Then came the surge, a jump to 112 meters, then 128, then 18.4. After that, the increments blurred all sense of physics. Within the span of 43 seconds, the dive computer recorded a depth of 672.3 meters. There were no sensor errors, no checksum failures, no log interruptions. According to the device, it had simply gone there. But Thomas hadn't moved. He had not felt the water pressure increase. His suit had not compressed. His body showed no signs of trauma or nitrogen loading beyond what would be expected for a standard 70-meter dive. The analog depth gauge, still clipped to his gear, reflected his actual journey uneventful, steady, safe. Yet here, in uneditable code, was an account of something else entirely. Something impossible. By all known physiological standards, no human body can withstand a depth of over 300 meters without suffering catastrophic internal damage. At 600 meters, the ambient pressure would have crushed even hardened steel. But the dive computer wasn't guessing. It had measured something. He tried to reach the device's diagnostic logs, but a portion of the memory was encrypted beyond even his administrator access. That was not standard. Thomas had customized the software himself, specifically to avoid proprietary lockdowns. The deeper he dug into the files, the more they resembled a black box recording from an aircraft. Redundant logs, fail-safes, subroutines he didn't recognize, protocols written in a language he hadn't installed. He closed the laptop slowly, the screen fading to black, and turned to stare out the narrow cabin window. The sea beyond was calm, a mirror of stars shimmering gently in the darkness. He found no comfort in its stillness now. The water had always been honest. Cold, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but honest. It followed rules: pressure, gravity, time, breath. But now it had presented a contradiction, a lie, or worse, a truth he wasn't meant to see. The next morning, Thomas returned to the coordinates, not to dive, but to observe. He dropped a remote submersible drone, equipped with a camera and sonar. The feed streamed directly to his tablet, displaying the smooth descent of the drone as it followed the same slope he had traversed. The screen showed basalt cliffs, occasional rock falls, the absence of fauna. As the drone reached 70 meters, the image stuttered. Just a momentary glitch. Then another at 85. At 103 meters, the screen flashed white. When the feed returned, the coordinates had changed. The drone was now reporting a location several kilometers northeast of its starting point, hovering in absolute darkness. No terrain visible, no movement. Its sonar showed nothing, no bottom, no walls, not even a return signal, just black. Thomas initiated a recall. The drone did not respond. For 23 minutes, he sent repeated commands. Then, without warning, the drone surfaced at the original drop point, camera offline, log data corrupted. Physically, it was intact. The battery level was normal, but the internal memory module had been wiped clean aside from a single log entry. Depth, 998.6 m. No pressure warnings, no implosion triggers. Just that line. He stood on the deck, the wind brushing against his skin, the tablet in his hand, and the silent sea before him. The coordinates hadn't changed. The water had not boiled or risen, but something had shifted. He could feel it, like a curtain slightly pulled back, just enough for a glimpse. The next call he made was to Dr. Lena Marquez, a former colleague at the University of Edinburgh. A deep-sea physicist and systems engineer, she had once specialized in high-pressure sensor arrays for deep trench drones. They hadn't spoken in years, but Thomas trusted her. If anyone could decipher what had gone wrong or what had gone right, it was her. He sent the dive log, the drone data, and a brief summary. He left out the emotion, the confusion, the gnawing sense that he had encountered something not merely unmeasured, but unmeasurable. He did not mention the brief, split-second moment somewhere between the 125-meter reading and the frozen screen when he had heard something. A sound, low, resonant, not from the device, but from the water itself. A thrum, like a pulse beneath the current. He told himself it was a hallucination, an echo of the alert tone. But even now, hours later, it lingered in the back of his mind like a song he couldn't unhear. And as the night deepened and the tide shifted, he checked the dive computer once more. The screen remained black, but when he placed his finger gently against its glass face, he could feel a faint vibration, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm. Thomas remained at sea, anchored just beyond the slope where it had happened. He kept logs, monitored currents, scanned sonar for anomalies, but found nothing out of place. The ocean had returned to its quiet, indifferent self, masking whatever secrets it had briefly revealed. And yet, something had shifted not in the water, but in him. Each morning, he checked the dive computer. It remained dead. No power, no warmth. But the sensation he'd felt, subtle as breath, still lingered in his mind. He found himself staring at the device longer than he intended, sometimes until the sun had drifted too high or too low. It became a sort of totem, a question with no shape. At night, the silence in the cabin grew oppressive, broken only by the soft ticking of his analog depth gauge, a sound that had once comforted him, but now seemed mocking. On the fourth evening, Lena responded. Her message was cautious, polite, but laced with curiosity. She had reviewed the data files, reconstructed the timestamps, and run simulations. Her conclusion was methodical, but unsettling. There were no signs of software failure, no indications of a corrupted pressure sensor or timing error. In fact, she said, the dive computer's readings were internally consistent, as if it had encountered a sudden, localized shift in gravitational gradient. That was the only explanation she could offer without invoking something speculative, something not measurable. What you're looking at, her message concluded, is not a malfunction. It's a data point outside our current model of the environment. Proceed carefully. That phrase stuck with him. A data point outside the model. He closed his eyes and tried to recall every second of the moment the screen had jumped. Had he felt something strange in his body? Any shift in pressure on his eardrums? A squeeze in his chest? But no, nothing had happened. And yet the dive computer had recorded a depth nearly 10 times what his body had endured. That night, the dreams returned. They were not vivid in the usual sense. No images, just pressure. The feeling of being watched from below. A sensation of descent that never ended, as if falling through a shaft that never grew darker, never narrowed, just down, endlessly down. And always the same sound, just beneath hearing. A distant hum, deep and steady, like the breath of something alive in the abyss. When he woke, the sheets were damp with sweat, and the cabin walls seemed closer than they had before. The dive computer remained unmoved on the table, yet somehow, it felt as though it had watched him sleep. By the end of the week, Thomas made a decision. He would go back. Not with the drone, not with a full dive team, just him. Controlled, measured, one more descent. He calibrated a second dive computer, brand new, untouched, and set it to log at 3 times the normal rate. He carried 2 analog gauges, a redundant tank, and an emergency ascent reel. Every precaution was followed to the letter. If it happened again, he needed verification. The sea that morning was unnervingly calm, its surface glass-like beneath a colorless sky. As he descended, the familiar silence of the deep returned, wrapping him in its cold embrace. 60 meters, 70, 85. Stillness. The basalt slope emerged beneath him once more, dark and smooth, like the flank of something sleeping. He kept descending, his breath slow and measured. The gauges tracked normally. No sign of error. Then, at 98 meters, it began again. The water around him did not change, but the digital depth reading jumped. First to 112, then 142. He froze in place, adjusting his buoyancy to hover. The second dive computer showed the same progression frame by frame, both units ascending in depth despite his motionless position. 175, 212. Still no change in light or pressure. Then came the sound, not from his earpiece, not from his regulator, but from the water itself. A tone, not loud, but dense, like a vibration that passed through his bones rather than his ears. It held no rhythm, no melody, just presence. He spun slowly in the water, shining his light in all directions. Nothing moved, no sediment stirred, but the sound grew subtly louder, as though he were approaching it without moving at all. 287. 310. His heart pounded, though his breathing remained slow by force of habit. He had never seen anything like this. And then, at 320, the world shifted. For the briefest moment, the water ahead of him shimmered not like heat distortion or bubbles, but like a curtain of glass being flexed. Behind it, he glimpsed something. It wasn't a shape exactly, but a distortion, a suggestion. Like depth folding inward on itself, a vortex made of silence and pressure, and then it was gone. The dive computers froze, both of them. The analog gauges read 100 meters, and just like before, the digital screens locked at impossible numbers. 472. No alarms sounded, no vibrations, only stillness. He began his ascent, every movement slow and precise. No sudden shifts, no signs of nitrogen toxicity. His mind was calm, almost empty. The fear came later, only after he had surfaced, removed his mask, and felt the sunlight on his face. He didn't speak for hours, didn't check the logs. He just sat on the deck, staring out toward the horizon, where the water met the sky like a seal over some hidden wound. Because whatever had happened, whatever he had seen behind that ripple in the deep, it hadn't been a hallucination. It had been watching back. The water had returned to silence, but Thomas could not forget the sound. Even days after surfacing, it echoed faintly at the edge of his hearing, an impossible resonance that seemed to pulse beneath the skin rather than through the air. He tried to dismiss it, to isolate it as a trick of pressure or fear, but it remained with him like the afterimage of a flash burned into the mind. It wasn't just that the dive computer had recorded an impossible depth, it was that he had felt it, as if part of him had gone somewhere his body never followed. He didn't sleep much after that second dive. When he did, the dreams came sharper, more focused. They weren't abstract anymore. Now he could see the slope in perfect clarity. Every ripple in the basalt, every unnatural angle, every smooth edge that suggested carving rather than erosion. He would descend as before, slowly, carefully, but in the dreams, the shimmer appeared earlier. It hovered ahead like a veil suspended in mid-water. And always, on the other side, something waited. He never saw it clearly, only the sense of size, scale, watching. When he finally reviewed the dive logs, he discovered something more troubling than the numbers. The time codes had diverged. Both computers had logged the same depth values, but the timestamps no longer aligned. On one unit, the moment of the shimmer appeared at 10:42:13. On the second, it occurred at 10:44:51. Nearly 2.5 minutes of unaccounted for time. The analog stopwatch strapped to his suit had recorded the total dive at just under 26 minutes. According to the computers, it had lasted over 31. One of them had continued tracking while the other froze. Or perhaps both had logged real time, from two different versions of it. He ran the numbers again, rerouted the dive computer logs through analysis software, checked system clocks and backup diagnostics. Nothing made sense, unless he accepted the idea that something had altered the perception or flow of time itself during the dive. He thought about sending it all to Lena, but something held him back. She would try to explain it, rationalize it, or worse, she would believe him. And he wasn't sure he wanted that anymore. The deeper fear had grown quieter, colder. Not the fear of dying in the water. That was familiar, manageable. But the fear of being noticed, of having brushed against something aware, something intelligent not like us, not bound by our limits, but real in a way that made everything else seem simulated. He started avoiding the water altogether, not just diving. Even standing on the deck too long made his chest tighten. The surface had become a boundary. It was no longer an invitation, it was a warning. The sea had allowed him to glimpse something it usually concealed, and now it watched him with patience, like a door left ajar in a house you thought was empty. The vibration from the dive computer never returned. It remained lifeless, a cold shell. But when he turned it over one morning out of habit, he noticed a faint crack running diagonally across the backplate. That hadn't been there before, and within the tiny fracture, nestled under the casing, was something even stranger, a black residue. Fine, almost powdery, not metal, not salt. He scraped a sample and examined it under a makeshift microscope. The texture resembled carbon, but the refractive index was off. When light passed through it, it didn't scatter, it bent, as if trying to escape the material rather than reflect off it. He ran a magnet over it. Nothing. Applied a heat source. No change. But the most disturbing reaction occurred when he brought it close to his old analog depth gauge. The needle moved. Just a tremor. A flutter to the right and back. Then again. It happened only when the substance was near, and only with the analog instrument. The digital units remained unaffected, as if the material had no electrical interference, only a pull on mechanical systems, like it wasn't part of the water at all, but something introduced into it, something foreign. He placed the sample in a sealed vial and locked it away, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. That black speck had ridden up with him, possibly from the other side of the shimmer, and if it had crossed over, what else could? By the sixth night, Thomas no longer trusted the silence of the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a drawer felt like a signal, as if the rules of sound were breaking down. He would wake suddenly, convinced someone or something was moving just outside the window, always out of view. And worst of all, the dreams had stopped. Not faded or diminished, but stopped entirely. He would lie down, close his eyes, and drift into unconsciousness but wake hours later with no memory of rest, no flicker of a thought. Only the unsettling awareness that something had been there. A presence. Not a voice. Not a face. Just a certainty, as if returning to a room where someone else's breath still hung in the air. He kept a journal, recording everything. Symbols, times, behaviors. His handwriting grew tighter, more obsessive. The margins filled with questions he didn't remember writing. And over, one phrase repeated itself. It was never about the depth. It was about what sees you when you get there. He didn't remember writing that either. The island was only 15 nautical miles from the dive site, a speck of rock and jungle that had once hosted a weather station, now long abandoned. Thomas hadn't planned to set foot on land, but the silence aboard the vessel had grown heavy, pressing in on him like water pressure. The ocean had taken on a different presence, no longer vast and open, but cloaked and watching. He needed distance, not from the data or the computer, but from the place. The coordinates had become more than just numbers. They were a threshold. He secured the vessel to a mooring post on the edge of a shallow cove and stepped onto the coarse sand. His legs felt unsure, unaccustomed to solid ground. The jungle beyond the beach whispered faintly in the wind, not loud, but filled with movement, branches shifting, insects humming, something cracking faintly deep in the underbrush. The sound of life. The absence of that sound underwater had grown unbearable. He climbed the trail toward the weather station. The concrete structure had caved in on one side, vines pouring over the roof like spilled veins. Inside, the air was musty, thick with mold and dust, but it was quiet. He could breathe here. He set down his pack, unfolded the maps, and laid out everything he had: logs, charts, sonar readouts, satellite images. And in the center, the sealed vial containing the dark powder he had recovered. He stared at it for a long time. It didn't move. It didn't emit any signal. Not an electromagnetic range, not an infrared, not even ultraviolet. But when he placed a compass next to it, the needle tilted slightly. Then again, a few degrees more. He had measured the shift dozens of times. It was consistent but unpredictable, like gravity bending in directions he couldn't plot. And he knew something else now. The powder wasn't native to that depth. It wasn't sediment. It wasn't volcanic residue or organic breakdown. Its composition didn't match anything in marine records, not even under electron scan. One night, he had sent a sample fragment through Lena's secure channel. She had returned her analysis the next morning with only 2 words. No match. But she'd also sent an audio file. It was distorted barely more than static. But at the 22-second mark, a tone emerged. A single, droning resonance that vibrated through Thomas's headphones, the same frequency he had felt in the water. She had extracted it from the background noise of the dive logs, buried in the telemetry. When filtered and amplified, it became unmistakable. A signal? It had structure. Not language, not music, but intention. That was what terrified him most. It wasn't random. In the ruined station, he opened his journal and read back the lines he didn't remember writing. Some were rambling, but others were alarmingly coherent, even elegant. Phrases like, "The fold is not in the water, but in the agreement of time," or "It watches from the inside of distance." These weren't his words. He didn't write like that. At least he hadn't before. One entry chilled him more than the rest. Dated 3 nights prior, in his handwriting. "It knows I can hear it now. It's getting louder because I'm learning how to listen." He flipped the page quickly, as if by doing so he could dismiss it as fiction. Madness. But deep inside, he knew he wasn't hallucinating. This wasn't a psychotic break. He had evidence. The computers, the readings, the material, the tone. Even Lena, rational, grounded Lena, had stopped replying. Her last message was 3 days old. "Don't go back there, Thomas. Some depths don't end. That phrase echoed in his mind. Some depths don't end. Back on the beach, he stood facing the water as dusk fell. The horizon bled with gold and indigo, the surface so calm it reflected the sky like a mirror. And for a moment, he saw it again, not with his eyes, but somewhere deeper, a shape beneath the glass. Not moving, not approaching, just waiting, vast, still, and aware. He didn't dive the next morning. He couldn't. Something in his body resisted, a physical tension that turned his muscles stiff. But he couldn't leave either. The vessel sat idle in the cove, the coordinates of the anomaly glowing faintly on the monitor. He sat for hours just staring at the numbers. Eventually, he took the dive computer and placed it back on his wrist. It was still dark, still unresponsive, but now, when he moved his arm, he could feel it again faintly, barely there, but real. A vibration, not mechanical, a pulse. His own heart, perhaps mirrored, or something echoing it, matching it. The sea no longer felt separate from him. It was not a place to visit, not a landscape to measure. It was becoming a language he had begun to understand. And with that understanding came a cost, the slow erosion of his own certainty. He no longer trusted what his senses told him. The lines between memory, imagination, and reality had grown thin, translucent. He found himself whispering to the water before sleep, as if asking permission to rest, and sometimes he thought he heard it whisper back. The sea had always followed rules. Pressure increased with depth. Light diminished. The cold crept in layer by layer. And always, there was the constant hum of physics, unchanging, reliable. But ever since Thomas had seen the shimmer, the veil beneath the slope, he had begun to feel those rules weaken. They still applied to the surface of things, to the measurable. But underneath, behind the curtain, something else stirred. Something older. He stayed on the island longer than he meant to. The weather remained stable, but his instruments had begun showing subtle anomalies. Barometric readings that spiked for minutes at a time. Sudden drops in salinity measured along the shore. Even time seemed to move strangely. His watch and the ship's chronometer would drift out of sync, sometimes by hours, then suddenly correct themselves. He kept detailed logs, but even those grew suspect. He'd read an entry written in his own hand and feel no memory of writing it. The ink would still be fresh. The pulse from the dive computer had grown stronger. Not constant, but returning at irregular intervals, like a heartbeat pausing, restarting, aligning itself to a rhythm Thomas no longer recognized as his own. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night to find the device glowing faintly, the screen flickering between deep blue and black, as if simulating depth itself. He stopped trying to repair it. It didn't want to be repaired. It had changed. Or more accurately, it was becoming something else. Then came the first dream that didn't feel like a dream. He was underwater, far deeper than he had ever descended. The light was gone, but he could see, not with his eyes, but with something wider. He drifted, not falling, not swimming, just suspended. Around him were shapes, not creatures, not exactly. They were outlines in the water, slow and immense, barely visible unless they moved. And when they did, the water around them listened. That was the word that came to him, even though it made no sense. These shapes didn't breathe or feed. They listened. And then, one of them turned toward him. There were no eyes, no face, just a shift. An awareness folding toward him like gravity taking notice. He felt it see him not with curiosity, but with ancient patience, as if it had been waiting for someone like him to arrive. And now that he had, it was measuring what came next. He awoke gasping, but not with fear, with awe. For the first time in his life, Thomas realized how deeply alone humanity truly was. Not alone in the universe, but alone in comprehension. We mapped the sea in pixels and sound waves, called it explored when we traced coastlines and trenches. But all that effort had measured only depth, not what occupied it. He began to suspect that the shimmer, the veil he had passed, was not a natural phenomenon. It was a threshold, a boundary not of distance but of awareness. It was not there to keep us out. It was there to keep something in. And now, that boundary had thinned. He noticed the signs in small ways. Fish no longer approached the cove. Seabirds avoided the shoreline. At night, there were ripples in the water when there should have been none. No wind, no movement. Yet the surface would tremble, faint and regular, like breath beneath silk. He recorded it all, but the recordings never played back what he'd witnessed. The footage would be blank, the sounds gone. Only the data logs remained raw numbers, corrupted time codes. One morning, while walking the North Ridge, he discovered a second crack this time, not in the dive computer, but in the earth. A hairline fissure, barely the width of a finger, running along the volcanic rock. Steam rose from it, silent and odorless. He dropped a temperature probe inside and watched the readings climb unnaturally fast. Then, flatline. The probe was dead, melted or simply unreadable. He felt an almost magnetic pull toward the fissure, and for a moment he reached his hand out until something made him stop. It was instinct. Not fear, but recognition. The same feeling he had in the water. The same sense that he was being watched from inside somewhere else. That night, he finally played the audio Lena had sent again. The droning tone at 22 seconds. But this time, he noticed something new. Underneath the tone, almost buried in the noise, was a second signal fainter, clipped. It repeated 3 times. He filtered it carefully, cleaned it frame by frame. What emerged was not natural. 3 tones, steady, paused, then again. They weren't random. They had rhythm, spacing, and they matched the frequency range used by early analog sonar, human sonar. He cross-referenced it with old maritime records, just to be certain. What he found chilled him to his core. The pattern matched a distress signal, one recorded only once in naval history. From a submarine that had vanished in 1968, lost in deep waters, never recovered. Its final log entry, recovered from pre-mission transmission, simply read, "We have reached a wall. There is something on the other side." Thomas sat motionless in the cabin, the headphones sliding from his ears, the dive computer pulsing steadily against his wrist. The depth had never mattered. It had always been about what waited beyond it. He had expected the island to change, and in time, it did. Not in ways visible to satellite or photograph, but in the minute distortions that mark a place unraveling. The air itself thickened. Insects no longer buzzed. Even the birds that had once nested along the cliffs disappeared. At night, the trees leaned the wrong way when the wind came in, swaying toward the sea instead of away from it. And in the soil, things no longer decomposed properly. He found a bird carcass, untouched by rot or insect, preserved like a wax figure, its feathers still smooth but its eyes long clouded. Thomas stopped documenting these changes in his logbook. Not because he lacked curiosity, but because he knew he had crossed a threshold where measurement meant nothing. The instruments still worked. The numbers still came, but they no longer reflected anything. Reality had begun to drift, not dissolve, but tilt, and he was sliding with it. He avoided the fissure now, not out of fear, but out of respect. The crack had widened, just slightly, enough for the steam to rise in new patterns, curling and coiling as if shaped by something unseen beneath. Sometimes, he would catch the scent of copper in the air, warm and metallic. It reminded him of blood drawn too deep beneath the skin. The dive computer had begun showing patterns of its own. It no longer responded to touch or movement, but it responded to proximity. If he brought it near the vial with the black residue, its screen would flicker random strings of symbols, glyphs he couldn't decode, not letters or numbers. When recorded and played in sequence, they looped every 108 seconds. A perfect cycle. A message, maybe. Or a countdown. He tried to contact Lena again. This time, the message bounced. Server not found. Her academic profile had vanished from the university database. He called the department line, No answer. Just a clipped, synthetic voice stating the number was no longer in service. It was as if she had never existed. The next morning, Thomas found something new on the shore. A fragment of metal. Old, scarred with time and corrosion. Embedded in its curve was a serial number, barely legible, but he knew what it was. A pressure plate, from a submersible, and not a modern one. Its design matched Cold War-era deep-sea craft. The exact kind used in missions like the one that vanished in 1968. He traced the edge of the metal with his thumb, and for the first time in weeks, a thought surfaced in him that he had tried to bury. Something has come back, and it had brought pieces. The plate wasn't rusted the way it should have been after decades underwater. It bore signs of stress not from pressure, but from bending, as if it had been reshaped not by force, but by warping. Like time itself had bent the alloy. He placed it beside the black sample in the cabin, and for a moment, both objects vibrated in unison. Just once. A pulse. Then, stillness. He slept that night under a tarp on the beach, unwilling to return to the walls of the ruined station. The sky above was clear, but the stars didn't look quite right. He couldn't name the constellations. The alignment was off just a fraction, but enough. It was as though the sky had tilted with the sea. Then came the sound. Not from the trees, not from the cove, but from beneath the sand itself. A hum, low, harmonic, rising like the slow pull of tide through stone. He pressed his palm to the earth and felt it steady, living. Not seismic, not mechanical. Something alive, and with that hum came memory. Not his own, but something else. He saw flashes, steel walls, and red lights, men in uniforms gasping as the depth gauge climbed. He saw them press their hands against windows fogged with condensation, their mouths open in silence, staring at something vast beyond the hull. Then dark. A silence so deep it broke. He sat up gasping, sand clinging to his sweat-soaked skin. The hum was gone, but in his chest, the rhythm remained. He wasn't remembering what had happened. He was receiving it. The black residue, the shimmer, the impossible depth. It was all part of something larger. A breach not of space, but experience. The ocean had always been alien, but what lived within it wasn't just alien. It was aware. And for the first time in what may have been eons, it had recognized someone who saw it back. He returned to the ship the next day. It no longer felt like home. Just a barrier of fiberglass and rust holding back a truth that pressed closer by the hour. He gathered every piece of evidence, every log, every artifact, and prepared a final dive. Not to escape, not to explore, but to cross. The shimmer had not been a glitch. It had been a door, and it was waiting to open again. The ocean was perfectly still on the morning of the final dive. No wind touched the surface. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, but the water already shimmered as if anticipating light. Thomas moved through the motions like ritual. Every strap, every gauge, every O-ring was checked 3 times. But the preparations were not about safety anymore. He knew now that this descent would not obey the rules of physics or protocol. This was a passage. The dive computer, silent for days, began to pulse again the moment he powered on the rebreather. It didn't light up. It didn't boot. It simply vibrated slow and steady, as though syncing with something deeper than his breath. Thomas felt the rhythm not in his wrist, but in his spine, as if his bones were remembering a frequency they had never heard before. The coordinates were the same. The slope, the basalt shelf, the place where the shimmer had first revealed itself. But something had changed. Not the depth, not the topography, the feeling. The water tasted different. He had never noticed the taste before, but now it was unmistakable, slightly metallic, like oxidized blood. He descended slowly, his limbs heavy but steady. 90 meters, 100, 120, still no shimmer. The world around him had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the ambient clicks and distant whale calls had vanished. It was like sinking into a void. Then came the flicker. Not in his eyes, but in space itself, like a curtain of air passing through water. The shimmer wasn't ahead of him now. It was everywhere. The water grew denser, not in pressure, but in presence. It began to resist him not with force, but with thought, as though it were asking permission, and when he did not resist, it accepted. There was no threshold this time, no sudden rupture. He simply slipped through, and the world changed. The first thing he noticed was the absence of time. His dive computer no longer ticked. The stopwatch was frozen, but his breath still moved. His heart still beat. Everything looked the same, and yet it didn't. The slope beneath him had deepened into a chasm, not a sudden drop, but a widening spiral, like the threads of a vast, unending screw carved into the planet itself. And all around him, the water shimmered with faint light pinpricks like stars, suspended in liquid night. He descended farther. 300 meters. 400. Numbers meant nothing now. His body should have failed, should have collapsed beneath the pressure. But it didn't. The suit held. His lungs held. He felt no fear. Only a deep, awe-stricken stillness. The kind of stillness that belongs to ancient cathedrals or the vacuum between stars. And then, at a depth his instruments could no longer name, he saw it. A shape in the chasm. Not an object. Not a creature. A form. It didn't glow, yet it cast light. It didn't move, but it drew the eye. It was not symmetrical, not built of bones or tissue, yet it breathed. Its presence was undeniable. It filled the water around it with quiet gravity. Thomas drifted closer, not swimming, not falling, just drawn. The dive computer pulsed rapidly now, vibrating with a kind of urgency. But it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like recognition. The same way a key might hum when held near the door, it was meant to open. The shape was vast, towering. Not a leviathan, not a building. It defied comparison. Looking at it was like trying to remember a dream you'd never had. It existed in dimensions he couldn't parse. Edges folding and unfolding like language spoken backward. And when it turned, though nothing visibly shifted, he felt its attention fall upon him. It was not a gaze, not heat, not threat. It was understanding. And then it reached into him not with limbs, but with memory. In a single moment, Thomas saw it all. He saw the vanished submarine from 1968, drifting through the veil. He saw its crew alive, transformed, still moving through a world beneath ours. He saw the shimmer open and close like a breath held between epochs. He saw Lena not missing, but taken standing at the edge of some alien vista, her face calm, not frightened. He saw a civilization not built, but grown existing, beneath time, inside pressure, beneath the crust of thought. And they were not evil. They were not gods. They were other. And they had been waiting not for conquest, not for contact, but for understanding. Because only one who descends beyond measure can see them. And Thomas, in that moment, became part of it. Not drowned, not consumed, rewritten. He did not remember surfacing. He did not remember the passage back through the shimmer. But when he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the deck of his vessel. The sky above was not the same. The stars had changed again. The constellations were gone. Or perhaps he had gone. The dive computer rested beside him. The screen was dark, but engraved on its surface now, as if burned in from the inside, were 3 simple, perfect lines. You crossed. You saw. Now you carry it back. And in his chest, where his heartbeat should have been steady, there was a new rhythm pulsing beside it. Thomas didn't speak for the first 3 days after he returned. The boat drifted in still waters, unmoored, the engine untouched. He had no appetite. No need for it, really. His body responded as it always had: breath, heartbeat, the mechanics of life, but something fundamental had changed. Not in his blood, not in his brain, but in the space between what he thought and what he knew. The stars above were wrong. Not unrecognizable, just subtly, fundamentally misplaced. A constellation where it shouldn't be. a planet that rose too soon. It was like waking up in a house you knew by heart, only to find the furniture rearranged, the walls breathing, the windows watching. The sky had shifted, or he had. He tried once to explain it in the journal, but language failed. The words came shallow, pale imitations of what pulsed in his memory. It was like trying to paint sound or measure grief with a ruler. Every sentence collapsed under the weight of what he'd witnessed. And what he'd become. The dive computer sat on the table beside him, still dark, still pulsing once every 62 seconds with that low vibration. A hum, subtle and bone deep. It had become part of his rhythm now. He could feel it when he moved, when he slept. It wasn't invasive. It was familiar, like the tick of a clock in a room you've lived in too long to hear. He powered on the satellite array again, just to see. The networks were active, signals flowing, but every channel he opened led to static or redirection. He searched Lena's credentials, gone. He typed her full name into every registry he had access to. No academic articles, no published works, no record of her research grant. Just a hollow, untraceable silence, as if her presence had been unwritten, methodically erased. And yet, he remembered her, not as an image or a voice, but as a tether. She was still somewhere, not lost, not dead, just shifted. And he began to understand that this wasn't isolation. It was transition. The things he had seen, the form in the abyss, the shimmer that wasn't light, the structures grown rather than built, were not revelations. They were invitations. The dive hadn't been an intrusion into another world. It had been a recognition. Like a key finally aligning with the right lock, he hadn't just seen them, he had been seen back. And now he carried that gaze within him. It was subtle at first, shapes in his peripheral vision, sounds with no source, a low, layered whispering when he stood too long near water. But it grew. The longer he remained on the surface, the more the ordinary world began to strain around him. Clocks skipped seconds. Mirrors briefly reflected angles he hadn't turned. Electronics faltered when he passed too close. The radio once played a voice that whispered his name in a language he didn't know, and then turned to static before he could record it. He wasn't afraid. He missed it, the weight of the water, the stillness of that other place, the sense that time bent gently around meaning rather than progress. The sea had always been a place of mystery, but now he understood it wasn't just mystery, it was memory. A memory far older than land, older than breath. And some part of it had recognized him. He took the black sample, the residue that had never corroded or decayed, and dropped it into the ocean one morning, just as the sun bled over the horizon. It vanished instantly, not sinking, not floating, just gone, like a blink erased from film. He had started to dream again, but the dreams no longer felt like projections of his mind. They were locations. He would find himself standing at the base of spiraled towers, their geometry shifting when he blinked, walking along halls of pressure and current, with walls that pulsed like gills. Voices spoke to him, never loud, never cruel, but patient, instructive, as if teaching him how to see without eyes. He recorded none of this, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real, too sacred. Writing it down felt like trying to trap something divine inside a bottle. There was one dream that returned often. In it, he floated just above the shimmer, not crossing, not descending, watching. And on the other side, countless forms moved. Not men, not beasts, just minds. Minds with shape and weight, flowing like smoke and water. They weren't alone. Others joined them, figures that had once been human. Divers, explorers, lost crews, each one changed, not dead, not broken, just transformed, translated into a version of themselves that fit. And somewhere in the middle of them, standing still and unshaken, was Lena. She looked at him without expression, not asking him to follow, not warning him away, simply waiting. He always woke with the same sentence echoing in his mind. We are not meant to conquer the deep. We are meant to return to it. Thomas began to realize something deeper. The impossible depth was not a place you went. It was a threshold inside you, a readiness, a resonance. The sea did not take everyone. It chose. And now, having seen through its eye, he no longer belonged among those who hadn't. He wasn't just marked. He was becoming. The island was empty when they found it. The vessel still anchored in the cove, secured as if it had only just returned. Everything aboard was intact. The logbooks, the maps, the instruments, each one meticulously placed. But there was no sign of Thomas. Not in the jungle, not along the shore, not in the water. It was as if he had stepped out of the world in the middle of a breath. The last page of his journal had no writing, only a drawing, simple, precise, made with steady hands. It showed a spiral descending into darkness, with faint points of light orbiting the curve like stars. At the very center, a small dot, or an eye, or perhaps an opening. The dive computer lay beside the sketch, dark and cool. It no longer pulsed, but its surface bore the faint outline of 3 glyphs, etched not with ink, not scratched with tools, but embedded in the material itself. No one could decipher them. Not linguists, not mathematicians, not even the AI systems trained to find patterns in ancient languages. The symbols matched nothing in human history. But still, some who looked at them for too long reported a strange sensation, as if something just beyond comprehension was speaking through them, not to them. One diver, a quiet man from Marseille, placed the computer on his wrist during a supply transfer. He claimed to hear something. Not sound, not a voice, just presence. He removed it after 30 seconds and never wore it again. Later, in private, he told the others he'd had a dream that night. In it, he was descending endlessly, not drowning, not afraid, just falling, and on the ocean floor, a doorway waited, not made of metal or stone, just space. Holding its breath, the investigation concluded nothing. Officially, Thomas was listed as missing, presumed dead. No body, no signs of struggle, no clear explanation. The currents in that region were mild, the weather stable. There had been no accident, only absence, but the data he left behind was undeniable. The dive logs showed descent beyond all tolerances, depths not compatible with the limits of his body or suit, pressure readings that flatlined, not because of malfunction, but because the instruments couldn't measure what was there. One log ended with a transmission spike in an unrecognized wavelength, an oscillation that, when converted to audio, produced a hum. The same frequency, again and again. And buried inside it, when slowed down 800%, was something eerily close to human breath. No one could explain that. But it wasn't the data that haunted those who studied his work. It was the silence, the certainty that something had opened, something had let him through, and now it was waiting again. Not malevolent, not divine, just patient. As the weeks passed, those who had contact with the site began to change. Subtle things, loss of time, dreams that came in fragmented languages. Some began to speak of a feeling, a pull, not curiosity, not obsession, but a sense of returning. As if the sea had whispered something to them, and they were slowly remembering it. One marine researcher, reviewing Thomas's voice logs, paused at a specific timestamp. 3:33 a.m., 48 hours before his disappearance. In the clip, Thomas spoke barely above a whisper. He was talking to no one, or maybe not to anyone human. He said, "I thought we were exploring, but maybe we're not explorers. Maybe we're fragments. Pieces of something that left the sea long ago and forgot how to hear it. But it remembers us. It's always remembered." And then he laughed. Quietly, almost sadly, he ended the log with 6 final words. They never meant to keep us out. It wasn't a warning. It was a realization. In the years that followed, other divers went missing in the same region. Not many. Just enough to remain coincidence. Their names were added to lists, their stories dismissed as tragedy. But the ones who studied the data, who really listened, knew better. They recognized the pattern, the spiral, the shimmer, the pulse in the current. The question that never needed words. What lies at the bottom of the ocean isn't darkness, it's memory. And sometimes, when the silence deepens and the stars shift slightly in the sky, the ocean breathes in, and it remembers who you are.